So let's have a look at Saturn in Pisces in a little bit more detail. One thing I want to emphasize, especially for these, the slower moving planets, often people are thinking in terms of what is the historical meaning of this to get a meaning for now. And I find that it's a double-edged sword, because the planetary alignments are never really the same. They can be very similar, but they're never fully the same. And so we always have to take that with a little grain of salt or even a big one, and recognize that there are some things that actually will be quite different. And so we can't necessarily say, yeah, this is what it's going to be. We have to always look in particular at the ruler of the sign that the planet is moving through to see what the quality of that is. Now, I've done a really in-depth video about Saturn in Pisces, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time looking at that. I just want to go over a little bit of what that represents, and then have a look at these the dates. Like I said it earlier, Saturn is still in and is leaving Aquarius, where we have a lot of intellectualism, a lot of ideas, a lot of issues around the collective, around society, around inventiveness, inventiveness, innovation, and science. Skepticism is actually one of the features of Saturn as it goes through Aquarius. And I think what's been very striking about this time is the combination of the skepticism that arises and the political condemnation of that skepticism, and that's coming from certain areas, not all. Censorship having been very, very powerful. And so that's kind of the shadow aspect of Saturn going through Aquarius, but that's backed up by Pluto in Capricorn, that control and that aspect of censorship. And so this is something to keep in mind, because this is now coming towards the end of the sign, and we often see that kind of thing showing itself. So where we initially are not really seeing very clearly, we're under the most impactful part of it in the initial part of the transit. We start to look more deeply as the transit goes forward, and then we start to realize what's actually going on. And this is, I think, the evolution of Saturn in Aquarius. Now, when Saturn moves into Pisces, we're definitely moving into a zone where there's much more of an awareness of our fragility. Pisces represents the end of this mortal shield, this mortal body, and the notion, again, this kind of more advanced notion of understanding our collective imperative, our need for each other, our interbeing, our interconnectivity. And then recognizing when Saturn goes into Pisces that we also need to make that mean something. So it's not, we can't be ungrounded. We can't be airy-fairy about it. It's not enough to have these lovely ideas. We actually have to structure them. Now that is the case in your life, particularly obviously wherever Pisces is in your chart. But it's also the case where we find that collectively. Where are we not taking responsibility? Pisces can also represent illness. It can represent illnesses that spread through the collective. It can also represents poison. So Scorpio as well does, but Pisces is more like intoxicants and things that are not really clear, things that might not be easy to pin down. In the same way as you could consider any distraction an intoxicant. So Pisces also represents like cinema, Hollywood, movie industry, Bollywood, things that are escapist. So that energy, when Saturn moves in, Saturn's like, you know what? It's gone on a bit too long. Now you got to sort that out. In the beginning, it will be, again, like I said, at the beginning of the transit, it always tends to magnify. It always tends to be stronger. So we may see through the spring and summer a tendency to not want to look, not want to step up, not want to be aware of what's going on, whether that's personal or collective. But over the period of the 2 or 3 years that we're going to have Saturn there in Pisces, we are going to have a reckoning where we have to really explore what's going on. So this is definitely a big shift of energy. It's moving from air into water for Saturn. And also Saturn is now going to be ruled by Jupiter. A Jupiter-ruled Saturn is very different to Saturn when it's in its domicile, which it has been for the last 6 years. Saturn in its domicile is extremely rigid and strict and powerful. Saturn ruled by Jupiter needs to have a bigger picture, needs to have a sense of righteousness. It needs to have a sense of doing good, being a positive influence. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting time because there's going to be this sort of cultural awareness of some of the aspects of the last 3 years that people are slowly waking up to, and at the same time a desire for something to be softer, to be more livable, to be more spirited, to be more in the influence of a Saturn that is conscious, let's say, as opposed to simply dirigiste, or kind of organizing things from the practical level. There's also this on a personal level when somebody has Saturn in Pisces, and I think a couple of you, at least two of you, are having your Saturn return, although I don't think you're here now. But anyway, those having the Saturn return, when Saturn is in Pisces, there can be a feeling of not being supported. And that can come, I think, in a collective way, like not being supported in the sense that you don't feel you fit in, don't feel like you fit into this world. What am I doing here? Why? Saturn in the 12th house can have a similar vibe, but Saturn in Pisces for sure, and having this feeling of I don't share a lot of what seems to be important here, and that can have people just losing faith in themselves, losing faith in faith, meaning religion or spiritual practices, losing faith in life itself, even. And so I do think we're also going to see socially a big influence around, people who just can't do it anymore. They just can't take it anymore. And we might find that, although it's already a trend in the last few years, there may be quite a number of people who are just unable to bear it. Life feels really hard when Saturn is in Pisces, because the energy of Pisces is to see things as they are, meaning in the capital R, real, true, capital T, true expression of life as interconnected, as coming from compassion, as coming from a place of connectedness with all things. And when Saturn is there, it's about making things practical and being pragmatic and having to relativize and having to say, well, yeah, but not really. And that can be quite difficult, especially for a person who's not easily grounded in reality. So we do have a number of very challenging transits this year that are going to upset people's sense of reality and upset their sense of grounding. So, that distrust or the mistrust of Saturn in Aquarius, which doesn't trust groups, doesn't trust being a participant in society, doesn't like being in groups. With Saturn in Pisces, a person it takes it even a little bit further, which is more like, I'm just going to disappear, I'm just going to dissolve. So I'm either going to take drugs or go back into whatever addiction I had, or I'm going to go into my spiritual life and do my spiritual bypassing thing. And so all of that is to make the person feel safe, so where Saturn in Pisces is going to be a very different vibe socially, especially because Pluto is then going into Aquarius, which will change the whole framework as well. From the point of view of solutions, that's helpful. We want to, with Pisces, Saturn in Pisces is about dissolving ego. That's something that Saturn in its own signs doesn't really understand. Saturn in Aquarius or in Capricorn, which we've had for 6 years pretty much, is very ego driven. It's very goals driven. It's very much driven by material results or something happening, or what I want, how I want to individuate from the group, or how I want to fit into the group. Saturn in Pisces is very much about dissolving that. And so on an individual level, this will also be very helpful, is to recognize that I can be in service the greatest contribution I can make is if I let go of this very powerful sense of me. And again, for some people who are not easily equipped or not sufficiently equipped to feel grounded and to feel solid in themselves, that can be really destabilizing psychologically and socially. And so we need to constantly, while Saturn is in Pisces, cultivate a grounding, cultivate some framework for a spiritual practice, some framework for community, some framework for what we believe. I always suggest, when with my students and clients, I always want to challenge people to recognize what they genuinely believe. And I think this is what Saturn in Pisces asks us to do. I think if you have that natally, it's definitely something that you are here to understand. What do I believe? And sometimes we're not aware because we are operated sort of unconsciously by our beliefs, and they're so powerful and they're so insidious that we don't actually recognize them as such. We just operate like that. And so understanding, what are my beliefs? What do I believe? What is my genuine connection to life itself, but also spirit and religion and belief, even the word belief. What do I believe about that? And so we can't just sort of, sit back and hope for the best, hope for change. We have to really grapple with what is my worldview. Saturn in Pisces is very much about understanding that there's a framework that is a spiritual framework for how we live in this world, and what is mine, what is my worldview, and is that going to help me move through these challenges? Because when we understand, especially in the world of astrology, it's one of my biggest bugaboos, is that there's so much wishful thinking and sort of hopium, and this idea that Aquarius means we're all going to collectively awaken and everything's going to be fine, and kind of conveniently ignoring that there's maybe 2% of the world that is even remotely interested in any of these things that could be described as awakening and consciousness movements and, yoga for that matter, or anything like that. And so we have to understand that it's always going to be an individual task. This awakening is our own task. It's up to us, and it may not happen in this lifetime. And this is something to understand as well. It doesn't we can become more aware, but it doesn't mean that we're going to be fully realized. And so again, it's avoiding this spiritual bypassing, which is this, hopeful, hopey feely kind of thing that says it's all going to be great and we're going to be enjoying, a complete different, a change of society. Is like, just wait till I get to the Pluto and Aquarius bit. So yeah, we have, also, and just to keep in mind that since we also have Neptune, I'm not going to talk a lot about Neptune today, but we do have Neptune in Pisces, and it's been there since 2011. Very, very long time to have Neptune in Pisces, because it's a very strongly emphasized quality of Neptune. Then it's even more sort of vague, and things can be, we're seeing a lot of the results of Neptune in Pisces in terms of both drug abuse and people checking out of reality, as it were, in many different ways, but also deception in terms of how we live collectively, deception coming from all different angles. So the good and the bad, but also an increase in spiritual practice and spiritual awareness. That's for sure something, at least in the West, that has been increasing in many cultures too, not just in the West. But so when Saturn moves into Pisces, although initially it won't be very close, it'll still be co-present with Neptune. It will take a while. It takes until 2025 before Saturn finally meets up with Neptune. And then they're actually going to meet up in Aries at 0 degrees of Aries, which is the Aries point, which is the global point. So there's going to be something very powerful happening around 2025. I will speak about that again and again. So we have it in 2026 in February, but I think it's also already in 2025. I'll double check that and I'll let you know. I don't have it in my notes, but we'll see a big shift in the world at that point as well. 2025 is quite a powerful year. with regards to Saturn, just for now, I wanted to also plant the little seed in your mind that Saturn met Jupiter, which is the ruler of Pisces, at 0 degrees of Aquarius, and that was at the winter solstice, or the solstice of December 2020. That's a very significant transit because it sets up a whole cycle of 20 years. So really, since then, we've already been moving into this kind of air cycle between Saturn and Jupiter, which was always traditionally in astrology, before the outer planets were known about, it was considered to be very much a shift of era, a change of era. So we can consider that that actually began in 2020. And so Saturn is recalling its journey through Aquarius, and it's now sort of reconnecting with Jupiter in indirectly, because Jupiter is ruling it now in Pisces as of March, and then Pluto will be triggering that point. So again, that's that 0 degree point, which is quite significant, that is coming up again and again in our cultural reference, in our collective reference, let's say. Yeah, so we have Saturn in Pisces through 2025, so the 24th of May, and then it goes into Aries, and then it goes back from the 1st of September until the 13th of February 2026. And then at that point, again, that February date is when Saturn is going to conjoin Neptune at 0 degrees. So that is, again, a very important cycle, a very long cycle, but we'll have to leave that for another day because 2023 is a big story in itself. In terms of the ingress chart, it's always interesting when a slow-moving planet, you can always do this for any planet, but especially for the slower-moving planets, it's interesting to see what's going on at the moment that they move into the next sign. And so here we're seeing, and again, don't worry about the houses because this is just set up for where I am. It's not relevant. I didn't put the ascendant in for that reason. And so you have Saturn, of course, at 0 Pisces. You have Pluto at 29 of Capricorn. And so they're at these what are called critical degrees. And if you'll notice the position of the Sun-Moon opposition here, we have the full moon in Virgo just hours before Saturn actually moves into Pisces. So there's something quite significant when lunations line up with very significant events. It's always really worth paying attention. And I think this is something that represents some awareness. It's now we are aware, and I suspect that we are collectively aware of what I've just described. This last 3 years of over-intellectualizing, of the fear of one another, fear of the other, that has led to us obeying Saturn, obeying authority, and becoming aware of our fragility as Saturn moves into Pisces. Pisces is emotional, it's vulnerable, it's spiritual, it's a new awareness, some awareness coming from the illumination through the full moon, and awareness of the shift in energy, which is Saturn in Pisces. It is not a close conjunction, but it's still close to Mercury at this time. So Mercury is actually at the midpoint between Saturn and the Sun. So that those midpoints always tell us a little something as well. It's always interesting to look at those kinds of things. And then if we look into Aries, we also have Jupiter, which is just about to move into its conjunction with Chiron. And that conjunction happens on the 12th. So just days before Jupiter conjuncts Chiron in Aries. The way I look at that, and that's also connected to Venus. So this is going to happen at 14 degrees, and Venus will just be a few degrees off that. I see that very much, again, as another reckoning around our need to heal, our understanding about healing, our understanding about what is causing the suffering. If we look at Chiron in Aries, we have to look for Mars, because Mars is ruling. And so what is that? It's our violence and our disingenuous ways with each other, our less than charitable ways with each other, our deceptiveness. We've got Mars in Gemini. By the way, Mars at 21 Gemini is the US Mars. That's the Mars of the United States chart. So I think that this also will have some significance around the United States and how things are operating there. We know now that the United States is much more open about wanting to go to war openly with Russia. The proxy war that's going on currently is being spoken about more in those terms. So they've dropped the pretense of trying to save a democracy, which never was a democracy. And they are also openly talking about waging war against China as of 2025. So I think we're going to see more and more of this impact on the US chart. United States has already just had in December its last of 3 exact conjunctions of Pluto to the US chart. And so that is what happens in a nation that is, or an empire that is coming to an end, which is usually the symbolism of Pluto returns, is that they become more extreme. And that extreme quality brings out whatever is already in the chart. And so extreme militarism, extreme tendencies to control. So Pluto in Capricorn is all about control and money, power, money, all the Capricorn things. So I do think that we could be in for a very volatile period of time that is, believe it or not, more volatile than what we actually are experiencing now. And I suspect that the Saturn ingress is going to show us something about that. And then certainly the Pluto ingress will as well. Yeah, so it's a broad margin, but we still have Pluto squaring the nodes. Now we're going to have Pluto squaring the nodes. That's not that's really broad in terms of an orb, but we have Pluto squaring the nodes basically from April all the way through October of 2023. So we'll get into that when we see Pluto, but that's already showing up here with Saturn moving into Pisces. Oh, and again, Neptune, once again in a square with Mars. Neptune was in a square with Mars in August and no, not August, in September, October of last year. So that square of Mars in Gemini to Neptune in Pisces is very much about propaganda, and deception is definitely very important at that time to beware of what you're being told and take it with a healthy dose of salt, and to recognize that there's something that you're not seeing clearly or not. And that can apply to your individual life, of course. And I suspect that it's going to very much apply to our global situation. And we have this sun, which is sextiling Uranus. So again, that suggests that, things can change very rapidly. Uranus is in a trine with the moon and sextiling the sun. And so I think things can change quite rapidly around that time as well, keeping in mind everything I've just said.